everyone, and welcome to another Space Warfighter Talk. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president of the Space Force Association, and I'm honored today to be with my good friend, Lieutenant General Rock Miller, who just took over Space Operations Command. Sir, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for making time. I appreciate it.
And sir, before we get started, I just want to say thanks to all of our sponsors and corporate members who allow us to do and accomplish our mission here at the Space Force Association, which is the only organization solely dedicated to the U.S. Space Force Guardians and their families. Sir, as we get started, as you discussed in your change of command ceremony and in your promotion ceremony, your career generated your leadership style. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about how your career evolved and then created the leadership style that you have today?
Well, I can certainly give you my perspective on it. There are others who probably shaped it a little bit more and have theirs. But as I mentioned, I think there's been three epochs in my journey as a young officer till probably my mid-career grades, and then most recently since I was pinned on colonel as a senior officer. And I think it's probably analogous to the journey that we hope that other people experience throughout the military. That they come in and from their first assignment, like I did, they have someone who is going to teach them how to do it and teach them how to be a guardian. I was received extremely well at F.E. Warren Air Force Base as an example as a young operator in the ICBM community. I had a great crew commander. I had a flight commander who was interested in me and my journey and how I came to be from New York to the missile fields of Wyoming and Nebraska. And I had a great squadron commander. And I think throughout that time, I was in learn mode. I told a story in my promotion, as you recall, that during my first few weeks of being an ICBM operator, we were going through an inspection. That inspection wasn't going as well as maybe the leadership wanted it to. And as a result, they needed to evaluate more crew members to make sure that we had that the crew force overall was ready, was combat ready. And I hadn't even pulled an alert yet. So I was really, really new and really, really young. And just to generate the number of crews they needed, they called and said, we need you to come out and take a check. And that's pretty daunting for a second lieutenant who's not pulled an alert yet. And you've got these, you remember from the ICBM community, you got these evaluators in their tailored flight suits looking at you, not saying a word. But as I was prepping for that, the same people that received me when I got to the base, my crew commander, my flight lead, they said to me, you want to be the best or you want to just talk about it? And that's been my approach my entire career. So that first epoch was about learning how to be a guardian, or at that time, an airman. In the middle of my career grade, I think that changed a bit. I think I became a master of my craft as an operator. And I was able to do that through successive assignments. I went down to Buckley for an assignment and then ultimately went here to Peterson. I had gotten married. And at that point, your perspective changes. It's not an I anymore, it's a we, right? So as your pronouns shift, the expectations on you shift. And it's not just about how anymore to do your job, it's about what we do as professionals. And I think in that time, it was phenomenal because we got the same kind of reception that I had when I was a young lieutenant, we had as a family. You probably met some of the people at the reception who took care of us. And I'm hoping that that's the experience that every Guardian has. And then as I got to be a colonel, and you've known me for a long time, I've had pretty much one dial and it's to 100, People saw that in me that's not going to be sustainable. That, just as you get a little bit older, as you get more and more responsibility, sometimes you need to refresh on why we do what we do. And I had some superb senior leaders, and still to this day. I receive a lot of mentoring, whether it's senior officers, senior enlisted civilians. They continue to pour into me and my family. And I'm just hoping that that's the experience that everybody's getting. And if they're not in Space Operations Command, they're going to get it while I'm here. Or we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they get it. We have benefited in the stand-up of the Space Force from being able to hand-pick the teammates on this service. And we need them to stay. We want them to be a part of this. We want them to make a career out of it. Nobody who's served for a career in the military has done so for money. I just described to you why I serve. It's because I love this nation and the teammates around me have supported me through thick and thin. I'm hoping that everybody's getting that experience.
Sir, thanks so much. And mentorship is, I think we're going to see that throughout this discussion is we'll see that come back more and more. Speaking of your career, realizing that you just came from the U.S. Space Command, can you give us an idea of the threats in and to space that we're facing? What did you see in your last role in U.S. Space Command's J3 that you can talk to us about in this setting?
Yeah, I think there were probably two key events in the threat space. One generated from the PRC, which is a major security challenge for the United States and obviously a global competitor, and one from Russia. Similarly, a major security challenge, not just for the U.S., but for NATO and our allies in Europe. I think from the PRC perspective, one that was really a challenge, but that I'm more and more impressed with how we're getting after it, is the launch of their fractional orbital bombardment capability. And I think that is a particularly destabilizing capability. That is the potential for an adversary to launch potentially a nuclear payload into orbit, leave it there for some period of time, and then deorbit it whenever they feel like. In this case, it was back into the PRC. That's a pretty destabilizing capability. And I think that is something that, while you probably have read in the paper, we've begun to restore military to military communications. Those are not activities that promote security and stability globally. And I don't think those are things that we want to do. I am and have been more and more encouraged about our response and our capability development to counter things like that. So I wouldn't say it worries me per se, but it is disconcerting. I just think that could be the borderline reckless behavior when we're testing out capabilities like that with the potential for unwarned re-entries of capability into globally when you're talking about a fractional orbital bombardment system. I think from the Russian perspective, really what manifested their pursuit of counter space capability has been really their mid-November of 21 direct-to-send ASAT test. I think the response from the international community, not just nations, but international agencies, to condemn that activity. And now we are, I think our last count was about 36 nations who have forsworn doing destructive anti-satellite tests led by the United States. But that was, again, there's just things that I think do not promote stability and security. And when we say we have global competitors, it's actions like that I think bring it to the forefront. But it's fundamentally a challenge to the rules-based order that has led to relative peace and security for America and our allies for 70 plus years. So those are two things when I was the J3 that I would say were well covered probably in the media, but that continue to this day to be concerning for me from a perspective of this is just potentially destabilizing behavior. And it's the reason, in my view, that America has a Space Force. So it's appropriate that they look to us for how are we going to respond to this. And I think the American people will be happy with what we're doing.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. And it's a unique perspective that you bring to this new position. So again, congratulations on taking the command, the inaugural change of command for Space Operations Command, and taking the flag from Lieutenant General Whiting.
Yep.
And so in that vein, what are your priorities for the command, and what are some of the goals that we can expect to see in your tenure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so I talked a little bit about this in the change of command. We had a commanders conference with the commanders and senior enlisted leaders for Space Operations Command yesterday afternoon. The spouses were there as well. So when I say our focus, I can say that now because it wasn't just the change of command, me. In the intervening 24 hours, we've socialized it, discussed it, and I can assure you it was vertical head nods up and down of understanding of why this is the focus. So if you had to put a bumper sticker on it, our focus in Space Operations Command is building combat-ready space power for America. So that's the quote that we're going to be focused on. Our ask from the Secretary and the Chief is to build on what's already been laid in a foundation from General Whiting and the team, and then build out more capability because that's what the nation needs. So in doing that, there are three interrelated primary roles that I, as the Space Operations Command commander, have, and that means that we, as a Space Operations Command team, must focus on. The first, you'll remember General Whiting would say, generate, present, and sustain space power. I have changed that just a bit because I think we need to focus on improving the combat capability we have today. So I would say it's generate and improve combat-ready space power. That means not just the systems that we are bringing online. That doesn't just mean the capabilities that we've operated in some cases for decades. It means our weapon system infrastructure, and it means an investment in leader development that I think we need to make sure that America's Guardians and Airmen and Space Operations Command are ready for the range of threats, but also more personally and professionally resilient. The second priority is, from the Secretary and the Chief, is to act as the U.S. Space Force's service force provider. What that means is, right now, the combat power that the Space Force builds is in Space Operations Command. What we have not stepped up to yet, because we were in the establishment mode of the service, but we're now, as General Saltzman turns this into a fully capable military service ready to execute the national security objectives, we need to start providing an assessment of, first, the options, the coordination, and the sourcing of that combat power, because trust me, the demand for space power is just growing. As you look at the future Navy forces, the operating concepts they're developing, or the Army recently, our joint force is becoming more and more dependent on space power, not less so. And the demand on those combat forces is growing. It is not just U.S. Space Command that is our principal customer. Every combatant commander is our customer. Moreover, the intelligence agencies want access to our combat power. We have a whole delta of hundreds of ISR guardians who are focused on surveillance, warning, and targeting of threats to U.S. systems. The intelligence community wants some of that. And then when you factor in our allies and partners who want to train, exercise, and develop interoperability, that demand distinctly only increases. So what the role of the service force provider is to take in that demand signal, assess what is the best way to source those combat forces, right? And then go back and coordinate, because there's no making everybody 100% happy with all of their asks, but I think we can, if we do it in one place, accomplish the preponderance of the needs of the other services, agencies, and allies and partners. And that's a role that SPOC will step into. The final one, I think, is I call it the combat forces proponent, and that's what I've talked to the service chief about. If you look into the other military services, the analog of a proponent is well established. In the naval forces, there is a submarine force proponent, a lead submariner who is responsible for the combat power in the submarine force, right? Similarly, Naval Air Forces has a lead airman who is responsible for that. I am the combat forces proponent for the United States Space Force, and the deltas under the integrated mission delta concept and our core deltas we have today are what General Saltzman wants to be the mission area proponents within the Space Force. Now, each one of those mission areas fights together, right? The 2nd Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Space Force Base certainly provides sensing, warning, tracking, and in the future targeting of space and missile threats to America. In the future, and today, when you see the threats like I talked to you about from Russia and some of the on-orbit threats they've had as they develop kinetic ASAT capability, they've got to protect and defend those systems. Well, they need surveillance from Delta II in space domain awareness. They need other capabilities from ISR Delta in how they're going to provide sense and warn and target to defeat those threats. So they're going to fight as a united team. The mission area deltas are responsible for the configuration of their weapon system, the operating concepts, and for advocacy of combat mission needs from the future force design all the way through force development and to the employment of the force. My role as the combat force proponent is to synchronize and integrate those, and where needed, prioritize those outcomes on behalf of the Secretary and the Chief. So those are the 3 areas we're going to focus on. That was the message I sent with the Chief out to the force today, that they're doing a great job. I'm very pleased with where we are today. What it's going to take to get to a fully combat-ready force is focusing on improving our combat power, how we're going to provide forces to meet the global demand, and finally ensuring our advocacy at the user warfighter level is baked in from the future force to the fielded force.
Sir, perfect. Perfect summary. And thanks for allowing us to capture that critical message. For you saying to the force, this is what you expect during your tenure. You talked a little bit about the integrated mission delta. Can you talk a little bit more about how many missionary deltas we can expect, and then what, if you put it in context, I mean, you and I were, we were involved in many exercises throughout our career. You remember being over in PACAF and talking about bringing in capabilities to exercise that out. So could you put it in the context of what does an exercise look like to feed back the testing and development, the tactics development through exercise and DT&E and OT&E, and then how that feeds back into material or non-material solutions to ensure you have the resources you need to execute your mission?
You bet. So I think the best way to do this is to talk about what we have established today, and then maybe talk about where we'll head in the future, where there's still some decisions that need to be made about what's next. So right now we have established prototype or provisional integrated mission deltas, and the fundamental reason the service chief recommended to the secretary to go to this approach was about ensuring unity of command for readiness in combat forces. It was a clear thing. Our history in space, because of our legacy, largely coming out of Air Force Systems Command at the time, was that the acquisition team had a lot of responsibilities, some of which that bred over into key components of readiness. So the sustainment of our combat-ready forces, to include basic fixes to the capability itself, or enhancements that needed to be done in order to keep pace as adversary threats changed. Almost the entirety of that force element that did that function was left into the acquisition force. So the squadron commander responsible for the mission, in this case, I mentioned to you 2nd Space Warning Squadron as an example. Now, we don't have a mission delta for missile warning yet, but in this case, the 2nd Space Warning Squadron commander had no direct authority over the people and the resourcing of the sustainment. It had to go ask an entirely different command to get that done. So what General Saltzman wanted to focus on is we are in an era of great power competition. We talked about some of the threats to space systems. We talked about really the global concerns we have with a Russia or a China and the need to try to deter any conflict in either area. The only way we're going to get to readiness is if we provide a unity of command over all of the elements of readiness. It cannot just be the squadron commander who owns the mission, owns the people who operate the system, and owns the equipment at his location. She or he must also own the resourcing of the sustainment of that. And that includes projecting forward major maintenance outages, making decisions on when readiness cannot be sacrificed, prioritizing which enhancements are needed as soon as possible, and then having an influence. The benefit, though, ultimately is a force development benefit that I think will reap big rewards. It is where finally our acquisition and operations communities will be integrated in a way that they have never done before. We will not hold out IMD or Integrated Mission Delta Commander positions for operators. That is a best athlete program. So right now, the PNT, or Position Navigation and Timing Integrated Mission Delta, is commanded by, in the past, what would be an acquisition professional. For me, he's just a commander. And he is making decisions about how do I get as much combat-ready PNT or NAVWAR capability into the fight as soon as possible. And for the first time, because the Secretary and the Chief did this, can start to control his own destiny in terms of what we are providing to the combatant commands. I think that it's groundbreaking. And we have not yet decided, the Service Chief and the Secretary have not yet decided which mission areas will be next. We are finalizing those recommendations now, and I think over the next weeks and months, those decisions will come out soon. But I think it's a brilliant success. If it was up to me, I'd take as much combat power as possible, as there is, and push it into those deltas as quickly as possible. But what we owe the Service Chief and what we owe the Secretary is what's the framework for deciding when systems cross over. And this is not a Spock enterprise alone. Can't do this without Space Systems Command. They're the owners of our acquisition portfolio. They own the program executive officers who report directly through the Service Secretary chain. We cannot be successful without them. And as I said, it's a best athlete program. This is not operators trying to grab acquisition. This is commanders trying to own every element of readiness. And that, I think, is going to be fundamental to developing combat-ready forces, and why those combat-ready forces will be aligned under a command that's focused on generating and improving that readiness, and that's Space Operations Command currently.
Perfect, sir. Really appreciate you describing what that integrated mission delta looks like, and then clarifying the concern that the acquisition community might have in terms of career progression, because it is best athlete program, as you said.
Yeah, I heard that early. I've not seen that. Now, let's be honest, I've been in Spock for 2 days, so my horizon is not as long as others. But I've had a couple of conversations with the two IMD. We also did a provisional integrated mission delta for electromagnetic warfare. I've not heard that as a concern. It's a best athlete program. And, it's my job in coordination with, currently General Gutlein, but when General Garant will take the flag here at the end of the month with General Garant. And then we need Tim Shaba and the STARCOM team to provide credible venues for us to train, test, and develop tactics to improve this force. So, there are a lot of responsibilities that Spock has, and certainly the preponderance of the forces are within Spock, but this is a team sport if there ever was one. We are designed to operate together. Force development is Tim Shaba's baby. He is responsible for taking that vision of the future force and the concepts that we operators try to push on and turn that into reality through training venues that we leverage, testing venues and range opportunities, all the way through professional military education. I mean, when the nation stood up the Space Force, the fundamental premise was what we were doing in Air Force Space Command, me as a wing commander and in my career prior to that, was inadequate to what the nation needs. That's why you needed a command that's focused on force development like STARCOM. So this is a team sport if there ever was one.
Sir, thanks so much for providing that perspective. And what I want to do is pull the thread a little bit on you as a demanding customer of STARCOM. What are your folks' advanced training needs to ensure we can get to those capabilities that we're going to need to ensure combat-ready forces are provided to the various geographics and functionals?
Yeah, I think it's good. Let's decompose that question just a bit, and then I'll end up with where I think the advanced training needs, because they're going to be different depending on the temporal aspect of where we are and what we are asking these forces to do. So different force elements will have different needs at times. Some force elements will have the same. But let's just baseline it up front. So training. There are typically within a formation, and it may have different names in different services, but there's qualification training you go through to get your basic status on your weapon system. So now for Dave Miller, when I went through training for EW, I went through a course that basically said you're minimally qualified to operate this weapon system. There's continuation training that I need to just keep being proficient, that as weapon system upgrades occur, as the threat changes, they're updating me on exactly what's happening, and I'm just staying current to that level. The advanced training needs, just like a commander owns qualification training and proficiency training as well, he owns advanced training as well. I think we've gotten confused. There are people who think that advanced training somehow goes into STARCOM. Absolutely not. They provide venues for the commander and his or her forces to access their advanced training requirements. But STARCOM isn't alone in doing that. A commander today can, through tabletop exercises, mission planning, rehearsals, there are a multitude of venues that when a commander identifies a specific requirement or is told of a requirement for their forces to be ready prior to their commit phase in the Space Force generation process, a multitude of options they have. What we're relying on STARCOM to do is take what we had to live with, which was not a lot of operational test and training infrastructure, and building out live, virtual, and constructive opportunities for that commander at any unit that they're in to access the capability to train to standard. But as I've told my commanders, all of them heard it yesterday, they own training. That is the fundamental precept of a commander. It's actually in statute that they're responsible for the readiness of their people. So once you baseline that and a commander realizes that she or he owns the requirement, then you can say, okay, well, where do those requirements come from? That's a great question. Some of them will come from me, that I see a change in the horizon, a threat, a concern about modernization, and I, as a part of their Space Force generation cycle, or the CSO may say, this is a tweak that we want to make sure we're ready to ensure that we are combat ready for this next commit cycle. A lot of them will come from the service components, from their combatant commands, to say, in EUCOM, if I have a requirement for an electromagnetic warfare capability, here is the threat environment you're going to face. Some of those training standards are mission standards, just like I was talking about, that maybe the proficiency level for continuation training is adequate. Some of them are, hey, that's a whole new type of threat. And we need to tailor our model and approach to training and tactics development to meet that threat. Well, all of that comes into that service force provider, right? And we track all that. And then we know, okay, when we're generating this force to go out to EUCOM, here is the standard we got to train them to. And then when we present that force, I owe that service component commander and the service chief if there's any deltas that I couldn't get them to and what the mitigation is associated with that. That is part of moving from the establishment phase of the service into building a combat-ready Space Force. And that's the link between all of the elements of training. You cannot have a discussion on advanced training without baselining where am I at in my qualification training and my proficiency training as well. And those advanced training priorities come from a multitude of places. Some of them are service generated, that we have new capabilities, new systems. We are tailoring new upgrades or enhancements for this specific threat that we see. But many of them, frankly, are going to come from those service component commanders. That's why it's so critical that we have a service component representative in those combatant commands. Otherwise, we'd be, in some sense, sort of doing our best guess. Now, the preponderance of our force is presented through General Chess in U.S. Space Force's Space. So obviously, he'll be a big voice in that process as well. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of requirements that these forces will have to train to. And it's our job is to work with STARCOM to ensure that whether that is Black Skies exercise or what, we are all of the venues we need to generate readiness. Why I'm so excited about this is over the next coming months, we are going to align our combat cycle and our training to be inter-unit as opposed to intra-unit. Right now, many of the Delta's training requirements, they're meeting largely in and of themselves. They're generating a requirement, going to STARCOM, and STARCOM is doing their level best to answer that requirement. That is a seam creator and a seam supporter, and that is not how combat forces fight. What we want to do is be able to say, when we present, in this case maybe to General Shesh in US Spacecom, a capability for missile warning, right? He knows that whether that is their ability to sense, warn, and track space and missile threats, whether that is their ability to protect and defend themselves against on-orbit threats, or whether that is their ability to provide targeting options in support of ground forces, because we are progressively getting more and more precise and timely in our warning messages that turn into actual target quality messages. He knows the full gamut is covered. That unit can't do that alone. They need other forces in order to do that, and that's why I'm excited about aligning and synchronizing the combat power that's in SPOC for force generation.
Perfect, sir. You touched on the Space Force's Space, and we know that's standing up at the end of this month as well. Could you describe just a little bit more about, maybe take a vignette and say, here's an example of, you walk through it for us very briefly, but from all the way from advanced training through to presentation of forces through Space Force's Space.
So, day to day, there are enduring missions that we were doing prior to the establishment of United States Space Force that continue to this day. Missile warning was the example I used. There are other missions that we do. PNT and NAVWAR, we've been providing that capability, the Joint Force, for literally one of the first missions we started doing in space. There are a number of those missions that are globally provided, that every combatant commander benefits from, that it is best for both effectiveness and efficiency to operate them largely out of one command and one service component, and that is Space Force's Space. Space domain awareness is another one that we provide for the globe, really, but certainly for the Joint Force, our allies and partners, awareness and tracking of objects in the domain. General SES has a requirement to be able to command and control that force structure on behalf of his boss, now General Whiting, 24/7. We have a requirement to ensure that as that threat changes, as a country develops or demonstrates direct descent anti-satellite capability, improved on-orbit threat vectors that we might see, cyber threats, that as that threat is changing, that we are cycling in combat-ready forces who are trained to that new standard as sooner or as quickly as we identify it. That's the value of a service component commander like General SES. He is constantly focused on employment today and not modernization 5 or 10 years from now. That was the challenge of the ask in the past from Air Force Space Command, is you had these competing priorities. Is on the one hand, you had to bring in all these new systems or upgrade to a new version while simultaneously being responsible for executing the operations, even if it was under a dual hat of a service component. I think one of the best things we could do was to separate those hats, have one command singularly focused on generating and improving combat-ready space power, providing those forces to all the components, not just General SES, and then finally being the proponent for improvement in those capabilities from future force to fielded force. Separating that, and General SES just needs to focus on being awesome today in execution. And that's why at every cycle now, I'm expecting General SES to come back to me and say, here are the deltas or the gaps that I saw in our execution or where I think we can get better. That is how advanced training requirements start to get built. As he starts to see things are maybe not as tuned as we need to be, he puts that demand signal right back on. And now, because we are building time in the schedule for our Guardians and Airmen to be trained, we can ensure that the next cycle has that combat power. Or, if needed, we can spin in, during the combat cycle, new capability.
It's a great demonstration, again, of the need for Space Force's space, and that perspective of saying the global nature of space is very specific, and that's where General SES is going to focus on. So thank you for that clarity, sir. It's relatively young service.
Yeah.
4 years. Congratulations on the 4th birthday of the U.S. Space Force.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts about the development of the Space Force warfighting culture as it relates to other services, and how do you feel Guardians coming from other branches of service contribute to that culture?
I'm optimistic. I have seen just yesterday, one of our Delta commanders, and he was actually on my morning tag up this morning. One of our Delta commanders, Dave Pheasant, is the commander at Delta 8, was a transfer from the United States Army. Some of our front office team have experience or frankly are people that have come from other services. I think their contribution to make and advance warrior spirit inside of the Space Force is invaluable. So I really value their opinion and perspective. We want to learn and take the best ofs from all of the services, not just the best people, but the best practices. Although I wouldn't mind taking their best people, and I think we have in some cases. And I'm very encouraged by it. I think right now, we're 4 years in. I think I did certainly, even as one of the leaders who was in early in the development of the Space Force, and I'm sure others outside the service maybe have underestimated how difficult it is to establish a new service. There are policy, statute, and a whole host of either direct, specified, or even implied things that a service must do in order to stand up and actually be effective in what the Congress told us to do when they said organize, train, and equip for space superiority. Just in the building and the headquarters of the Pentagon alone, that's a demand signal that is incredible. When you look out to the field, really where the warrior culture is at the tip of the spear, that has to be clear as day to them of what their expectations are today, but also a focus on never being satisfied. I think as I've gone around and seen the tactical units, I see that culture either well established or on its way to being well established. It's, part of my job is to make sure they have the tools they need to succeed. One of those things is to set up front the expectations on how we want our leaders to lead and what success looks like. Based off my discussions yesterday with the commanders and the senior enlist leaders, I'm not concerned. If anything, what I thought would be a multi-year process to establish a baseline culture. The baseline is already starting to be established, and now we just need to turn it into habit as opposed to practice.
And so how important is that to get at the very young Guardians?
Well, it's critical. That's why, I'm going to be Tim Shaba's most demanding customer. This starts at the accession point. So if you're at BMT, or if you're in, the academy, or in ROTC, or in OTS, wherever your accession point is, they need to understand exactly what it means to deliver combat-ready space power for this nation. I think that is part of the reason why you're seeing our service ask some really fundamental questions about how we build those Guardians. Retooling our initial training, our initial skills training for our Guardians. Making sure that everybody understands all of the core mission sets that we have inside of our force. We only have really 5 core AFSCs within the force, or disciplines. So we've got operations, we've got ISR professionals, cyber, acquisition, and engineering. That's really what we have as the focus. The rest of the team that's assigned, most of it in Spock, is airmen, providing medical care, defenders at the gates, protecting our bases and our weapon system infrastructure, all the way through to the personnel team that we have. Those core mission sets, they got to learn how to work together from day one. And that's why our initial skills training and revamping that is going to be so important. I think you're going to see some significant changes just in 2024 alone that will solidify that baseline warrior culture in a way that hasn't been before.
Thank you, sir. The industry is chomping at the bit to help you out. What is the best way for industry to engage to ensure that they can cover down on some of those most critical needs that you've got?
Well, I think we're doing a good job of not being secret about what our requirements are. And if they're confused, I'm happy to give them directly what I think they need to be focused on. I'm not going to get into a discussion about where I see core capability gaps. What I will say is we've got some priorities that we need to focus on, because I'm not interested in just pacing the threat. I want to exceed and precede any threat vector that could come. So their focus, if it was me, would be in a few key areas that I'd say generally they could help us with. One of them we've talked a fair amount about here, and that's helping actually Tim Shaba in developing the live, virtual, and constructive environments that our Guardians in Space Operations Command can access in order to generate combat-ready space power. The second is, I don't want to be in a position where we are asking Guardians to do work that automation or other tools can do for them more quickly. So I want to speed in, whether it's machine learning, automation, or where appropriate, artificial intelligence into our tactical operational units in order to free up Guardians to focus on thinking about the threat and developing new tactics and training models in order to get after that threat. So they can help us there. Finally, we got to continue to have the best technology across the board. So whether that mission set is how we are going to sense from space or the ground, whether that mission set is how we are going to provide surveillance and ultimately targeting of advanced threats, or whether that is how we are going to shorten kill chains and focus on precision in the capability that we provide, it's a nonstop, constant evolution, just like it is in any service. So I think, I know General Gutlein has done a couple of reverse industry days where he is going to them in order to tell them what our needs are. I'm happy to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in there and give them very plainly what I think our needs are. But I'm not interested in 10-year acquisition programs. So if that's what they've got, don't bother talking to me. My focus is the next 3 years in those first 2 hats of being the guy who generates combat power and the guy who provides that combat power to the combatant commanders and the other services. In my proponency hat, I'm willing to think longer term and try to focus on what the future end state looks like, and then tailor our research and development efforts in partnership with the other commanders to get there. But right now, our biggest need is now, and those things that I talked to you about are going to yield the most benefits.
Sir, you definitely need the resources to accomplish your space superiority mission. Mm-hmm. And your SFA stands by to help advocate to ensure you have those resources. Lieutenant General Miller, thanks so much for taking time today out of your very busy schedule, after just assuming command of Space Operations Command, to spend time talking to your Space Force Association about what your vision is for Space Operations Command. Sir, thanks so much.
Thanks for making time. We got a great team. I love talking about them, so thanks.